Now, Joaquim Oliveira Martins, is really a pity that I will miss the presentation. I'm sorry about that. We will have other opportunities to talk. As I said, Oliveira is going to establish a connection between the two sides. So on the one side, the expenditure and the determinants of healthcare expenditure, on the other side, the funding solutions and the revenues.
Thank you, Fabio, and thank you for the organizers for this splendid opportunity. So I would like to talk about the sustainability of the health spending, and for talking about sustainability, I have to see both the expenditure trends and also how this expenditure could be financed, right? So on the expenditure side, I'm going to use a set of recent health and long-term care expenditures that were produced by the OECD, and I was involved with it. For the revenue side, this is much more recent work. The OECD just started, for example, to send surveys, institutional sort of inquiries to countries to actually collect information about how the health care systems and long-term care are financed. So this is kind of still preliminary results, but basically what I want to do is to present these two sides of the problem. Before that, I would like to start with some very, very basic facts. The first fact is about the growth of health expenditure. We know that this health expenditure tends to grow in general much faster than GDP. So you see this this is total health expenditures and public health expenditures. On average, up to 2009, these expenditures have been growing at 4.5% on average for the OECD as a whole. You know that the GDP growth in the OECD is much below that figure, talking about 1-2%, right? So of course, this means that the share of health to GDP keeps always increasing. Now, in 2009, 2010, there was this very sharp drop of the growth of health expenditures, and some people say, you see, now the healthcare system actually is adjusting. The growth has been decreasing, but actually, because GDP even decreased further than the health spending, actually the share of health to GDP keeps increasing. So this is what we see in this chart. So this is the share of public health and long-term care expenditures as a share of GDP for all OECD countries since 1970 up to 2009, 2010. And what is interesting is that you see indeed this kind of interesting pattern is that it goes in like by steps. And the red parts, of course, are the parts where the ratio increases the fastest. And by coincidence, it's not really coincidence, but these are actually the periods where the GDP is sort of slowing down. So actually, Professor Johnson was kind of pleading for having an investment in health in periods of the recession. So either do we do it on purpose or not, this is what is actually happening. We are devoting more resources to help in a period where our economies are in a recession. And we do it perhaps not in an explicit or strategic way, but this is what is actually is happening. The share of public health in public spending is also going up, of course, and now it's reaching something around 16% of GDP. And of course, because it's reaching on average for the OECD countries this 16% of GDP, now the health spending in public budgets is very comparable with other big spending items like education 30%, economic affairs 16%, social protection 24%. So health now is one of the big spending items in public budgets, and of course governments are very sort of concerned about these trends, this seemingly sort of every increasing share of health spending to GDP. So people ask questions: how come this share of health care spending to GDP keeps increasing relative to GDP? Is it normal? Is this the reflect of preferences, or is this something else? So we did this work trying to understand what are the drivers of health spending. The drivers for health spending, we have the first sort of usual suspect is, of course, demography. Idea that people getting older, that tend to become more the probability of getting ill, etc. The morbidity increases, so you spend more in health. So we know now there is a very abundant literature on this issue. It's not at all age per se that drives this health spending. Actually, it's more things like the proximity to to this that really is a factor increasing a lot the level of healthcare spending. So I'm not giving here the details, all the projections, all the data, everything is available on the OECD website, but clearly we cannot explain this increase of health to GDP because of demography. The second usual suspect would be income. So the idea here is really something related with preferences. So this idea that health could be sort of a luxury good. Luxury good means that when your income increases, say, by 1%, the health spending to increase by more than 1%. So rich societies tend to spend more and more in health because when you are very well off in terms of your material conditions, what else could you expect of living longer in good health, right? So people, when they become richer, they spend more in health. The problem is that if you want really to explain this increase of the share of healthcare to GDP only by this income effect, you would need really a very strong what we call in economics the elasticity of spending to GDP, something like 1.8%. That means that if GDP per capita increases by 1%, the health expenditures per capita would have to increase by 1.8%, almost double. So this is a lot, and all the most empirical econometric studies on the estimating this value of the income elasticity do not provide at all that kind of figure. The most recent, most sophisticated estimates provide something actually a little bit below 1. So health will be at best a sort of a normal good. It means it just increases in line with GDP, and perhaps tends actually to increase a bit less faster than GDP. And the most recent estimates of this elasticity point to something between 0.8, 0.9, 0.7. So a little bit. So health would be a sort of a necessity in the jargon of economists. So it's not demography, it's not income. So what else? Often economists, when they don't know, what's driving a phenomenon, call it a residual. And actually, in the growth literature, for a long time, we have been dealing with what we call the solo residual, which has everything that explains growth in the top of capital and labor. And now there is more and more work, of course, in this residual in terms of the growth literature. But here is a bit the same. Now, in terms of this residual, which is really the bulk of the explanation for this growth of healthcare to GDP, we can go a bit sort of in this black box and try to understand what is behind this residual. The first thing is relative prices. By relative prices, I just mean that the volumes of goods, health goods and services react to variations in prices. If the price elasticity of these goods and services, what you call is very low, it means that when you increase prices, the volumes don't react in the same proportion. So when you multiply the prices by the quantities, actually the whole thing increases, right? So you increase prices and you increase the total expenditure. So this could be an explanation, providing that you are able to prove that this relation between prices and volumes, quantities in the health sector is ruled by a parameter, an elasticity below 1 in absolute terms. The second, culprit could be this idea of technology, but here it works exactly in the opposite sort of a manner. It means that actually, because there is continuous technical progress, improvements in technology in the health sector, people actually want more and more of these goods and services. Pretty much in the same way, computers, the price of computers have been decreasing all the time, right? And actually, the budget for computers and telecoms in our family budgets is now much bigger than it was, 20 years ago, right? So this is really the effect of technology. It decreases prices. I mean, price is adjusted for quality, but actually people, because precisely of this increase in quality, which is equivalent from the consumer point of view of a decrease of prices, it's really equivalent. Actually, you consume more and more of that good. So there you need to prove or try to estimate what is the relation between this impact of technology on demand. And finally, you could have the impact, of course, of institutions and policies. Governments sometimes take just decisions. They want, for example, to extend coverage of health sector. That's it, and so that has an impact on spending. So what I tried to do here, so I did in 2006 the first set, the first set of OECD projections, and now in this set of projections I tried really to go a bit deeper in this black box of the expenditure residual. I will not go into detail, so everything is available, but basically we tried to do a little econometric model to try to estimate these different components. So relative prices, the prices of health goods and services relative to the all prices in the rest of the economy, the effect of technology, and the effect of institutions and policies. So to give you a picture of how this residual, so the magnitude of the residual, so this is like we call it a growth accounting. So you have in the first column the growth of health spending, by country and for the OECD average. So we say, over this period, 95-2009, on average, health spending grew by 4.3% on average for the OECD. So this is kind of figure, the ballpark that we know, between 4 and 4.5%. So if we take into account the effect of aging, of course the effect of aging up to now is not very big, but we can make an estimate of it. It's very small. It can explain only a half percentage point of this increase of 4.3%. Now, if you make an assumption on the link between income and health spending, and here we make an assumption of 0.8, so it means when GDP per capita grows by 1%, health expenditures per capita only grow by 0.8%. So if we make that assumption, which is, as I said, the most recent estimates give that kind of estimate. So income can explain 1.7 percentage point of this 4.3. So it means that there is a residual there to explain, which is around 2% per year. So on the top of demography and income, health spending continues to increase by 2% in sort of the exogenous or sort of autonomous or residual way. Of course, this estimate of the residual depends a lot on the assumptions you make on your relation to income. If you, for example, assume that you have a much higher reaction of health spending to income, of course the residual will be much lower. That's obvious. One just thing is that this residual on average for the OECD is 2%, but it can be very different across countries. And in some countries, for example, like in the case of Korea, this residual is 6.5%. So, for example, if you do a projection and you just extrapolate this residual as it was in the last, say, 10 years, you end up by 2060 with 100% of GDP in Korea dominated by the spending in healthcare. So it's just not sort of acceptable, right? So it's very difficult to make projections on the basis of this residual on a country-specific basis. So what we did in the OECD basically was that we want to put countries in the same sort of a comparable foot and not project over the very long run these health expenditures on the basis of very specific country idiosyncrasies, which can be very specific for the most recent period. So we are using basically this 2% per year, which is the average of the residual for the OECD, as the effect of prices, technology, and policies that is applied to all countries. So, all in all, we are able, of this 2% unexplained residual 2%, we're able to explain around 1.7% per year, which is not so bad. So 0.8 can be explained by prices and technology. Actually, the effect of is mainly the effect of prices. We find a price elasticity which is significantly sort of below 1 in absolute terms. And then the parameter for the technology, I was expecting something much higher, but given that we proxied these effects of technology in a sort of very simple way, probably this is why we don't find a very strong elasticity. But we can explain 0.8 of this 2%. And then the other variables in the equation, which are also still very loose. Now we are doing more work on that, how to capture in a much more accurate way the effect of institutions and policies, because there was a huge study done with the OECD on the institutional setting of health systems, and this provides a lot of information that could be plugged into these econometric equations. Here we are just basically using things like dummies. But this sort of simple variables still capture something like 0.9% of this 2%. So we can explain 1.7% of this 2%. And as I said, so this is used to extrapolate, to make this sort of projections over the future. On the long-term care side is completely different. The world of long-term care is totally different from the world of healthcare. Long-term care is basically, there is a lot of technical progress in the health sector. In long-term care, we're talking about very, very, very basic services with no productivity, unless, in Japan now they're creating these robots, or no, they probably have these nursing homes done in a sort of with a lot of robotics, but I don't know. But as it is now, I think we can reasonably assume that long-term care is going to be a sector where there is not much productivity gains over the next decades. So as for the health spending, we have two types of determinants, one related with, say, demographics, and other related with non-demographics. On the demographic side, what we need to explain is really the increase in the number of dependent people, so people that are in need of this long-term care. And we identified two basic sort of determinants, one related with the increase of life expectancy, pretty much like in the health spending. One of the factors why demography was not explaining a lot the increase of health spending is because in some countries, of OECD countries, we are in this sort of healthy aging regime. I mean, we increase life expectancy, and this increase in life expectancy translates into years of good health. Right? And so this in some sense shifts the cost curves, so these curves that relate age to health expenditures per capita to the right. So you tend to spend the same amount but later in your life. So that has a smoothing effect on your expenditure. So this is one of the reasons, by the way, why the demography cannot explain the increase of healthcare. Here is a bit the same. With increases in life expectancy, this impact of disability is postponed a bit in the future. So that sort of has a smoothing effect on your healthcare expenditure. Now, the health expenditure per itself has an effect and can be a bit ambiguous. Because when you invest in health, of course, people have a better health, perhaps for a long time, but also you are increasing the probability of, at some point in time, being in this state of dependency. And we know that this state of dependency is really something that kicks in around 75, 80, 85 years old. So the more the average life expectancy in the population will reach that kind of threshold, the higher the probability actually that people will be in need of long-term care. So the health expenditure could have actually a negative impact. I mean, a negative in the sense that it pushes up the expenditure on long-term care. On the non-demographic side, we have again this effect of income. We could say, okay, long-term care people are not really deciding on the taking or not long-term care on the basis of their income level. But actually, it's not the people that are taking the decision, are the families. And indeed, there is some connection between the level of income and the quality of long-term care services. So there, in 2006, I assume there was no relation, but here we put a relation of 1-to-1 is an assumption. The other big determinant of these long-term care expenditures is what we call the cost disease. This is like the perfect storm in economics for what we call a cost disease. So we are talking about a sector which has no productivity. So it means that in relative terms, the more you have productivity in other sectors of the economy, the more the relative price of long-term care to other goods and services in the economy is going to increase, right? You also have this tendency for wage equalization in the economy. I mean, the people that are providing long-term care services, at the end of the day, they are going to align with the average wage growth in the economy, right? And then the third fact is that probably the demand elasticity, the price elasticity for these long-term care services is very low because you don't really decide, to be in need of long-term care. You just need it or not. So it's not really. So probably the price elasticity is very low. So if you put these three things together, you have the perfect storm. So it means that the cost, the relative cost and the relative price of these long-term care services is going to increase all the time. So this is really one of the main determinants of this increase of long-term care over time. Some people actually believe that this effect is also present for health. But in the OECD, I believe that because of this technical progress in the health sector, it's difficult to explain the increase of health spending because of this cost disease effect. Perhaps some segments of the health sector are affected by this problem because they use, for example, low-skilled labor with low productivity. But you see, as a whole, I would see the health sector actually as a sector where there is a lot of innovation and a lot of scope and potential for productivity growth. And then the last effect is actually related with the provision of informal care. In a lot of our countries, actually, long-term care is provided in a totally informal way by families. And unfortunately, mainly by women in this class of age between 50 and 64 that provide long-term care to their husbands, to their parents, etc., etc. The more we are going to ask this segment of the population to be present in the labor market, to work, to be active, to participate, the less they will be available to provide this long-term care. So this is sort of a policy coherence question there, right? If we want to put in place labor market policies, and this again with this question of policy complementarity that Fabio raised before, if we put in place policies to put these people in the labor market, we have to draw the consequences for the informal provision of long-term care. It means we have to replace this informal provision by a formal institutional provision of long-term care. So that also is an explanation for this for these trends. I will not go with details. These are the cost curves for long-term care. So they are really sort of exponential. So they are completely flat, and then suddenly they start, increasing very rapidly. And basically, when you arrive at the age of 90, you have like 60–70% of your population that, in a way or another, are in need of some long-term care. These are the costs per dependent. So what you see is that they are very stable. So when you are dependent, whatever are your age, you are 30 or 40 or 50 or 70, you spend more or less the same amount. So if we have this estimate for costs per dependent and an estimate of the number of dependents, we can make this projection. So what are the results? The results are this following. So in the first bar there, you have the public expenditures on health. Health is the blue, long-term care is the green. So on average, OECD countries spend now around 6–7% of GDP in terms of spending for health and long-term care. And we have two scenarios. One scenario is the one where things stay as they are now in terms of this residual. So it means long-term care and health care continue to increase more or less under the same patterns that we observed up to now, on average for the OECD, not country by country. And so that generates what we call the cost pressure scenario, where these health expenditures could increase from this 6–7% to 14% of GDP, so doubling from now to 2060. Then we have the cost containment scenario, where we assume that policies are able to bring down this residual growth from 2% around, on average, to 0% by 2060. So kind of a combination of policies can, of course, need to be a very complex package of policies that is able to actually reduce this residual growth. So if you do that, you just reduce a bit this pressure on spending, but still you end up with something around 10% of GDP by 2060. So even in this very optimistic scenario, you still have this pressure on spending in terms of public budgets. I'm not saying this is bad or good. It's just that governments had to deal with it. And of course, this increase in the health expenditure. So probably the reality will be somewhere between these two extreme scenarios. So we see that the orders of magnitude outpace completely what the things that we have for the pension system. For the pension system, on average, we have a bill around 3–4% of GDP on average for the OECD in terms of increasing pension expenditures over the next 50 years. For health, we are talking here something much more substantial. So this problem, quote unquote, of the health sector is a much more bigger problem than for the pension system. And then, of course, all these expenditures add up, and where we are going to find the money to finance all these social expenditures. So this is the results per country. So you see there is a sort of a differentiated results with some countries at a higher pressure than others. And one interesting fact that I would like to put here is that there is an interesting effect of demography. So demography doesn't explain the growth of spending, but explains the change of the structure of spending, right? Because we assumed actually that the non-demographic effect, so this residual, was homothetic. I mean, so it's really is a shift upward of the cost curve as a sort of, but is applied in a homothetic way to all ages. It doesn't have an impact on the structure because it's homothetic, right? So this change in the structure is only driven by demography. Demography explains not the growth, but the change in the structure. So it is the change of the structure. Is the following, that by 2010, 60% of our health expenditures, of 6–7% of GDP, are allocated to people below 65 years old. 40% to the people above 65 years old. So these people are above 65 years old, currently in the OECD on average, corresponds to something like 15, some countries 20% of the population, right? By 2060 is exactly the opposite. So 60% of the expenditures are allocated to people above 65 years old. Of course, the share of these people in the population is going to increase by 15–20% of the population to something like 25–30% of the population, but you are still talking about 1/3 of the population consuming 60% of the total health spending by 2060. I think this poses a very acute problem in terms of intergenerational sort of equity, because who is going to pay for that? It's sort of, I think is a sort of is a question that we should ask ourselves, and our governments are asking this question. How these projections compare with other projections? Well, basically, if you talk only about the EU, our scenarios between the cost containment 2.54% increase, percentage points increase in of health expenditures, and the cost pressure scenario 6.2 compare with other types of projections that were done by the International Monetary Fund. For example, for the US, the Congressional Budget Office also did some kind of projections. They find an increase of 7 percentage points of health expenditures to GDP. So our projections are comparable with other types of these macroeconomic projections. They are very different from the ones that were put forward by the Aging Working Group of the European Commission, because the set of assumptions is very different, and we could talk about that during the question sort of part. Very quickly on the revenue side. So what the OECD, of course, now that we perhaps have a little better understanding of the spending side, of the trends, of the drivers, the problem is that how we are going to finance this expenditure. So the OECD put in place a sort of institutional innovation, which, and this is really not easy, to put in the same table, around the table, the people from Ministers of Finance and people from the Ministers of Health. These two people have very different mindsets, and sometimes the dialogue is not so easy, right? So the OECD took this initiative, and we have what you call it a senior budget, SBO means senior budget official, and else joint network, and we are sort of organizing now regular meetings of this network to discuss about these options, and of course trying to strive sort of a balance between these two views of the world. The first meeting of this network in March this year really put forward three main issues. The first issue is the effect of this temporary cut. So governments are worried. There is a lot of other competing spending pressures. So they start cut, and there is a risk that these temporary cuts, in some sense, have really detrimental impacts in terms of the quality of your healthcare system in the future. Over the long run, so sort of a trade-off between the short run and the long run, and so this is really a concern that emerged in this meeting. The second concern is really about the sources of financing. So we know that because of the population aging and this effect of technology and the combination of the two, so you have this pressure on the spending side. On the revenue side, there is also a problem, because in many countries, actually, the healthcare is financed through taxation contribution on the wages, on the labor market. And we know, because of population aging, this part of the population that will remain active over the next decades is going to shrink, right? So it means that the tax basis to finance the healthcare sector is going to shrink too. So you have the expenditure going up and the revenue side going down. So if you compute the deficit associated with the healthcare system, probably the numbers could be a bit scaring, right? So this is what we are trying now, to do. So pretty much on the same basis we did the projections on the expenditure side, would like to do these projections on the revenue side. The third point that emerged in this meeting is this idea that the politics of healthcare are more incremental than in other areas, and this is related with this issue of synergies and complementarities. So in some reform areas, it's kind of easier to segment the problem and address the reforms with the group of people that are going to be affected by the reforms, even by compensating them. So here in the reform of the healthcare system, problems appeared as very complex. Like a system, and it's kind of when you have such a sort of degree of complexity, either you do a sort of a Big Bang type of approach, which can be very dangerous, because when you do a Big Bang, a sort of this kind of shock therapies that people did in transition countries in the early 90s can be extremely dangerous, because there is a danger that you really destroy the system, the coherence of the system. So people are saying that perhaps the reform of the healthcare needs to be a bit more on the incremental side because of this complexity. Now, I don't want to overrun my time, but we are doing data work in terms of collecting the sources of revenues to finance the health system. And we see that either it's through general taxation or taxes that are earmarked for the health system, but still a lot of countries pay the health system with payroll contributions to social health insurance. So in these countries, this problem on the revenue side is going to be extremely acute because of the shrinking of the labor force. There is also a problem associated with devolution of responsibilities of spending across levels of government. A lot of, some central governments actually gave the hot potato to subnational governments, to regions, states, or even municipalities. Huh? So this devolution of health spending to the subnational governments could be good because, as we said, as you exactly said, we need this kind of matching can probably be done in a better way at the local level. But the question is whether these governments have the capacity, for example, to undertake these PPPs that you just described. It's not sure. So currently what is happening is that in some countries, most of the spending now is in the hands of the subnational governments. But actually the subnational governments, so provinces, regions, cities, have the impression that all the parameters of the health system are not determined, are not under their responsibility and accountability. So what happens is that actually you have a sort of a soft budget constraint. So they spend, and then they spend on their assumption that the central government, the general budget, will pay for it. So we have even a problem of soft budget constraint that is emerging in some countries that needs to be addressed. We need to give the tools, the policy tools, to the subnational governments to deal with this responsibility. Now, there is a list of things, and you gave a beautiful list of sort of how to handle this cost containment sort of approach. I will not go for that. We are doing this inquiry, this survey across member countries to see what kind of policies are used when you have this spending that exceeds the budgeted targets. So you see that there are some instruments that are used more than others. For example, things like supplemental appropriations or cuts in pharmaceutical prices or cuts in pharmaceutical reimbursement. And this is much more, the frequency of these instruments is higher than things like subnational budget deficits, exactly what I said, or of a contingency fund or health insurance fund deficit. So there is kind of a panoply of instruments that are used to implement this cost containments. Just to give an example, in France now they have this, what they call it ODAM. So in French is national objective for the spending of health insurance in French. And this is actually the projected increase of health expenditures and what was achieved. And we do see indeed that over time, they kind of are able, in some sense, to rein this expenditure and bring the actually realized spending in line with what was projected. Now, how they do that? They do that by an institutional sort of a change. And for example, they put in place an alert committee that very early starts to say, oh, be careful, this year the health spending is sort of going into the roof, do something. And for example, when this alert committee sends a warning, this trigger automatic measures, for example, in terms of sort of freezing the budgeted increases in provider fees or reimbursements, or for example, in the hospital spending. So this kind of cost containment strategy seems to be working in a country like France. Now, these most recent 3 years where you have this alignment between what was projected and what was spent, so spend at the end of the day, is also years where there was this problem of crisis and this decline of the growth of health spending. So it's perhaps a bit difficult to disentangle the effects of the crisis and to the real effects of this policy, but this is the kind of policy that some countries are now experimenting. As I said, this is really something that is still in the making. I hope perhaps in a 1 year time to bring you much more data on this revenue side of the equation, which is now completely essential.